I set out to answer a simple question. Can you make $100 an hour playing low stakes poker? To find out, I played 300 hours at 5-5 over the last 5 months. And my biggest takeaway, the games have changed a lot since I last played low stakes full time in 2017. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. In this video, I'll show you how the games have evolved, what adjustments you should consider making, and most importantly, I'll reveal my results and dig into what they say about the state of low stakes poker in 2025. So, is the poker dream still alive? Let's find out. On one hand, the low stakes games are tougher now than when I played low stakes full time in 2017. And the first reason why the games are tougher is just because pre-flop, the players are much more aggressive and they are 3-betting at a much higher frequency. So let me show you. So I've seen stuff like this where I open in the cutoff here with ace king of spades, then we get 3-bet by the small blind and it folds back around to us in the cutoff. And in 2017, when players were 3-betting out of the blinds, this was pretty much just pocket jacks or pocket queens plus an ace king maybe. And today, a lot of players have watched a Doug Polk video. They know that they should be playing more of a 3-bet or fold strategy from the small blind. So players are much more aggressive here. I've seen players 3-betting here with hands like pocket eights, pocket nines, ace jack suited, ace queen off. Players are just much more aggressive when they 3-bet, even from the small blind, than they were 7 or 8 years ago. And another example here, we open pocket sixes from the low jack, get 3-bet from the hijack. And in this particular hand, this was actually one of the low stakes hands I played. And I ended up calling here. And when we got to showdown, the villain had 10-8 suited. So it's not even necessarily that they're choosing the right composition of hands, but just the fact that they are much more aggressive pre-flop makes them a little bit more difficult to play against. And it also means we need to be just a little bit tighter when we open from early position because a hand is just much more likely to get 3-bet now than it was when I played low stakes full time in 2017. So I want to do a bit of a point counterpoint here. And yes, players are more aggressive pre-flop. They are 3-betting more. But on the other hand, they are still making a ton of mistakes pre-flop. And some of those mistakes I see, they are calling still way too much. They are squeezing way too polar, and they are massively under 4-betting. So let's talk about these briefly one by one. All right, so this is a big blind defend range to a 3x cutoff open at 200 big blinds. And as you see here, even to a 3x open, the big blind should be defending very, very tight. We see they're only calling with about 17.8% of hands here. And they also should just be pretty aggressive as far as 3-betting. This whole upper left-hand corner of the hand balloon chart gets 3-bet. A lot of these suited connectors get 3-bet. A lot of this ace X suited gets 3-bet as well. But just not doing a whole lot of calling from the big blind, even to a cutoff open. But looking at the mass data, this is what a recreational player or a fish will defend at low stakes online to a 3x open from the big blind. And we see here, they are just extremely, extremely wide. And you may be saying, well, Mark, this isn't for live poker. Well, we don't really have data for live poker. And this is the closest we're going to get looking at how fish play at 25 NL or 50 NL facing a 3x open and how they defend the big blind. We just see here, we can kind of carry this over to live. You guys have seen how wide the recreational players, even the regs in your game, defend the big blind. They are just calling way too much. The difference between this and the equilibrium range, we see here they're calling about 37, 38% of the time versus about 17% of the time. So they are just calling way too much pre-flop. The other thing I've noticed quite a bit, so in this hand, we open pocket queens here from the low jack. We get a call, and another call. And now the big blind squeezes. I've seen this over and over at low stakes. They're squeezing more, but they're squeezing with kind of a polar range where they will show up here with hands like king 9 suited or ace deuce suited or ace 10 offsuit. They're just squeezing kind of their very, very best hands here, which is going to be like jacks plus or ace queen suited plus or something like that. And then just a bunch of trash. So they're going very, very polarized here, where if you look at this equilibrium range here, this is supposed to be a small blind squeeze range versus a cutoff open and a button call at 200 big blinds. And the thing you'll notice is this is just extremely, extremely, extremely linear. What I mean by that, it is good hands, better hands, and best hands, right? There aren't really polarized bluffs worked in here. You don't see hands like king 5 suited or ace 9 offsuit or 6-4 suited or stuff like that. It is just our very, very best hands and then all of our good hands. Because when you squeeze in a hand, it is just very, very likely you're going to see a flop. Well, if the pre-flop raiser calls, that's going to start a cascade effect and the players behind the pre-flop raiser are all going to call. And even if the pre-flop raiser folds, someone in the field who called the pre-flop raiser's initial raise is going to call. So you just want to be able to outhand them, so you go good, better, and best. And the mistake I'm seeing at low stakes is when players squeeze, they're kind of doing something like this, where they're kind of using the very, very top of their range, and then they just have these kind of weird polarized bluffs where they're using hands like 6-4 suited or 7-5 suited or King-5 suited. The specific combos aren't important, but the composition of their range is extremely polarized because it's very, very strong hands and then a bunch of trash. And the way that we want to exploit this, well, if we 4-bet with a hand like queens, our opponent will just fold their bluffs like King-5 suited or 7-5 suited or whatever that we have absolutely in horrible shape, and they'll continue with that very, very top of their range, that aces, that ace-king, that pocket kings, that type of stuff. So when our opponents are squeezing a polarized range, we want to fight back fire with fire. We want to be polarized as well. We want to be calling with the middle of our range, hands like queens, hands like jacks, hands like ace-queen here, and we want to be 4-betting the very, very top of our range, so aces, kings, maybe ace-king suited, and then a bunch of 4-bet bluffs, maybe hands like ace-5 suited, king-10 suited, and by fighting back with a polarized 4-betting range here in position, we're just going to be able to play very, very well against them, because my hypothesis, the reason why they don't 3-bet linear is because with kind of those middling hands, they're kind of lost post-flop and they don't know what to do, when to barrel, etc. So they kind of go with the very, very strong hands and the trash, so then they have an easy decision post-flop. So our exploit is just to do a lot of calling here when we are in position, and when we 4-bet, use the very, very top of our range, the aces and kings, whatever, when we can just cooler them, and some of the absolute bottom of our range where we don't mind just folding out their trash. Say if we have a hand like ace-3 suited here, or a hand like king-9 suited, where we just don't mind if they fold out their trash. So lots of calling, and we respond when they squeeze polar with a polarized 4-bet range ourselves when we are in position. The other mistake players are making quite a bit is they are just massively under 4-betting. So the way we can exploit that is we can just 3-bet them with impunity, because they really just aren't going to 4-bet us unless they have aces or kings or something like that. So we see here a villain opens in the cutoff, a recreational player, and we can just get away with 3-betting hands like pocket 5s or whatever on the button here and get them heads up, play a pot in position, because they're not going to 4-bet us off our equity. They're just going to call quite a bit. And while they've learned to be a little bit more aggressive 3-betting, they are not 4-betting nearly enough. And if you want to see this kind of backed up by theory, here is an equilibrium cutoff 4-bet range against a button 3-bet at 200 big blinds deep. You see, once again, out of position at 200 big blinds, we should just be going very, very linear if we are the cutoff here, and hands like ace-queen suited are just 4-bet pure, ace-jack suited, ace-10 suited, these hands are 4-bet at a very high frequency, hands like queen-jack suited, jack-10 suited, all of these good hands in this upper left-hand corner should just be 4-bet a ton, cutoff first button, but in actuality, what happens in game is players just call way, way, way too much, which lets us get away with 3-betting more. All right, back to why games have gotten a little bit tougher. Let's move to the flop now, and players are just c-betting much, much more. Yeah, they're not really delineating, hey, this board is good for me, or hey, this board is bad for me, but they're just kind of c-betting with reckless abandon from what I've seen when they're the pre-flop raiser. But this is kind of difficult to play against, and if you want proof that this is hard to play against, watch the video we put out a couple months ago called There Are No Good Players in Live Poker, where the solver decided to c-bet its entire range on a board that was horrible for the in-position player against 4 or 5 winning pros over and over and over again. The solver just decided to c-bet range. So playing against players who are c-betting just at a very high frequency is pretty difficult to play against, even for good players. This is another reason why the games are tougher. But counterpoint here, why the games are still pretty good, even though they are c-betting more, they're kind of splitting their range sometimes with their sizing, maybe using bigger sizes when they have strong hands and smaller or medium sizes when their hands are a little bit weaker. They're not double barreling nearly enough, and they are playing very, very poorly versus check raises. I'd say maybe the majority of players who are playing low stakes have massive sizing tells, even when they are c-betting as the pre-flop raisers. Let me show you an example. Here, the villain opens on the button. We defend in the big blind with 7-8 of hearts. Flop comes jack 9 deuce. And a lot of these players, what happens here, we see they c-bet very small on this board when they just have an ace high hand, or maybe a draw, or a hand like pocket 7s or something like that. They're kind of choosing a very, very small size, and then they're choosing a big size when they have pretty good hands like an overpair or jack X or a big combo draw or something like that. They're just kind of splitting their range and just kind of telegraphing their hand strength with their size. You would be surprised, even winning players I'm seeing at low stakes doing this. So the way we respond to this, when they choose a small size, when they're splitting the range, whenever we don't have showdown value, so right here we have 8 high, I would just be check raising, and we can just check raise to a smaller size here. We don't need to go absolutely balls to the wall. Maybe 2.5, 3x, 3.5x, somewhere in that ballpark. Get them to fold fold their ace highs. Get them to fold their pocket sixes, right? Just get them to fold all of their hands that are just kind of monkey c-betting here. And we can just print here because we know a lot of the time that they will just choose a larger size when they have good hands. And when they do choose this big size, we should just be massively over folding here. We should just be folding a ton. So if we do have kind of a crappy gutter here like 7-8, we just fold when they use the big size. If we have an under pair to the board, we just fold when they use this big size, right? We are just going to be doing a ton of folding when they telegraph that they have a strong hand. And if we have a strong hand ourselves and they choose this big size, do not slow play, right? They are just announcing, hey, excuse me, I have a very strong hand. I'm not folding. I'm at the top of my range. If we have a strong hand like Jack 9 suited here, just put in a massive check raise because your opponents have just told you in no uncertain terms that they have an overpair, they have top pair, they have a big draw, right? They have a very strong hand. We're not going to have a lot of fold equity. So what that means when we have a good hand ourselves, pile in money now. And you may be thinking here, hey, okay, some players in my games do this, but most players don't. What if I'm playing against somebody who's a little bit smarter and maybe just using one size? Well, in this case, we can take advantage of the pool's tendency to massively under double barrel, and we can just float on the flop quite a bit, and then they play face up on a lot of turns. So if we have anything with equity here, if we have a gut shot, if we have a pair, even if we have an ace high, we can just do a lot of floating here on the flop if our opponent is just using one size. And the reason why is because they are massively under double barreling turns as a bluff. So we have 8 high here. You see we float, we go to the turn. And if our opponent was to just put any money in on this turn, obviously we would just fold with a crappy gut shot here, but our opponent checks it back. We go to the river and we know because the board is wet and dynamic, because the turn was a blank, if they had a jack, if they had a set, if they had 2 pair, if they had an overpair, they would just keep double barreling on the turn. So getting to this river most of the time, the best hand our opponent is going to have is a hand like pocket 10s or ace 9 maybe, and most of their range is going to be much weaker than that. So we're never going to run into a monster here. We're never going to run into a brick wall. So we can just float the flop a ton, and if they do check back the turn and we get to the river with no showdown value, well, we can just run a big boy overbet bluff here because we know we're never running into the top of our opponent's range. And if we do get here with a hand like ace high, say we have a hand like ace 10, well, we can just check on this river, and usually the river will go check and we'll be good a lot of the time. And if our opponent does bet, well, then we can consider bluff catching. All right, another reason why the games are a little bit tougher now is because players don't sit as deep. I notice this time and time again over my 300 hours at low stakes when a big action player would win a couple of big pots and they'd be sitting with 1,500 or 1,700 in a 5-5 game. There was literally a countdown clock going on in my head where they were going to come up with some excuse at the table to leave within the next 5 to 10 minutes. So in 2017, when I played low stakes full time, this just didn't happen as much. Players weren't quite as terrified as playing deep, as locking up wins. The deeper we are, the bigger that skill edge becomes. On the other hand, games are still good because there is a much higher prevalence of side games and straddles than there was when I played in 2017. And first, let's talk about the straddle because I've seen maybe kind of some online pushback to the straddle talking about, well, the straddle doesn't really help win rate. Let's get this straight. If the straddle is on in the game and you are a winning player, 99% of the time having that straddle on is going to increase your win rate. Where people get confused, if the game goes from a 5-5 game to a 5-10 game and now stacks are on average 100 big blinds instead of 200 big blinds, well, you are winning less big blinds per hour. That's okay because you are winning more money per hour, right? So let's say at 5-5, you're a 10 big blind winner. You're winning $50 an hour when the game is 200 big blinds deep. Well, now the straddle's on, so the game's 5-5-10. You're only playing 100 big blinds, so our edge is going to decrease. So maybe now we are winning 7 or 8 big blinds per hour. Yes, we are winning less than 10 big blinds per hour, but our hourly now, because the big blind is now 10 instead of 5, we're winning $70 or $80 per hour. So yes, our edge is going to shrink slightly, but our overall hourly is still going to go up. In most games, unless the stacks are very short or everybody is just uncomfortable and doesn't really want the straddle on, those are exceptions. But in most cases, having the straddle on is going to increase your win rate. And I've noticed players are just much more agreeable to doing a round of straddles now than they were maybe 7 or 8 years ago. The other thing is players are much more open to doing side games like the 7 deuce game or the stand-up game. These games have become much more popular than they were 7 or 8 years ago. If you can get these games on, players will gamble more, your win rate will go up. And then finally, let's talk about bomb pots. Bomb pots were a big point of controversy for some reason during this challenge, but bomb pots are good. Players are generally bad at them. Self-admittedly, I am not great at bomb pots, but if the rest of the pool is punting extremely hard, you don't need to be great to making money. And these bomb pots just are going to increase the size of the game. Players are going to be unfamiliar with the strategy, and they're just going to punt. It is going to make your win rate go up. So in general, players are a little bit less willing to play deep now today in low stakes games, but they're much more agreeable to kind of straddles or side games or bomb pots, and all three of these things make our win rate go up. Another reason why the games are tougher is most players now, specifically at the $5 blind level, are capable of folding top pair when all the money goes in. Essentially, maybe 10 years ago, you could just put all the money in anytime you had top pair good kicker, and players just wouldn't be able to fold top pair with a weaker kicker. So poker was just easier because you could just offload the thinking, and every time you have a good hand, you just pile in money and players just pay you. Well, that's a little bit different today. I've noticed a lot of the player pool is very, very capable of folding top pair, especially 200 big blinds deep. On the other hand, that's another reason why the games are still good, is because players can fold top pair now. And yes, it's a little bit tricky because we kind of got to navigate this corridor between, can this guy fold top pair or can he not fold top pair? But we can now run big boy bluffs much more profitably. And you know, it's hard to make hands, but if players are folding, well, we can just print. It's much easier to have a profitable red line than to just make hands all day. All right, so we're playing 5-5. In this hand, we are deep. We're 1,500 effective, and the cutoff is going to open to 20. We 3-bet pocket quigglies on the button, and he calls. Flop comes 10-8-4 here. He checks. We are just going to c-bet our entire range using kind of a small size that incentivizes him to raise off his strong stuff, call with his weak stuff. So I go $50 here. He calls. Turn is now a deuce. This is a blank. We would think our opponent would probably raise off hands like pocket eights, pocket fours, 10-8 suited with a high frequency on the flop. So at this point, we're pretty sure we have the best hand almost all the time, but don't think our opponent is folding hands like ace high flush draws, open in straight draws, 10x, pocket jacks, etc. But none of these hands are putting in more money for us if we choose a small size. So we're just going to go very big here to maximize value. Our opponent is going to call. We go to this river, and the river is the innocuous 6 of clubs. Our opponent checks it over. And on this river, when we have queens, do we think our opponent's going to be calling when we jam for 1,140 into a $730 pot? Our opponent's going to be calling with a hand like king 10 suited or jack 10 suited on this river. And I would say most of the time in a 3-bet pot starting off deep, no. I think the pool is quite capable of folding 10x here if we put all the money in. And all too often I see people who say, well, this guy will never fold top pair here. And then on this river, they'll bet 500. Why? Right? You don't believe that, because if you believe that this guy's never going to fold top pair, you would just put in all the money on this river. So I think in all actuality, people are just fearful. And we have to be able to hold that logical thread. If we don't think our opponent is going to call with top pair, if we jam in all the money here with pocket queens, we need to be choosing a smaller size. And this is the size I see most people choose. It's 400, 500, 600, something like that. A big chunky value bet size, but not going all in. And the reason why we may not want to go all in here is because we think our opponent will fold a hand like 10x if we jam. So that gives us a great opportunity. If we get to this river with a hand like king queen suited, we have king high here. Well, let's just put in all the money. Let's get the 10x to fold. Let's get the ace high flush draws to fold. And sure, occasionally, our opponent may show up with a hand like pocket jacks and hero us. But if we're getting folds here from 80, 85, 90% of our opponent's range, this is just printing. And this is why games are still good, is because you can just pile in a ton of money as a bluff in these spots because opponents are so risk averse, because they are so fearful, because they tend to fast play all of their sets and their 2 pair on the flop or the turn. So the best hand they get to this river with is 1 pair hands. And we can just exploit the fact that the player pool is now capable of folding top pair and just print with our red line bluffs. All right, another reason why the games are tougher. There are less big fish, big whales, action players, and more trying players than ever before. Something has happened in the poker ecosystem, and even a lot of the mid-stakes games like the 10-20 and 20-40 and stuff like that are going private. And with the prevalence of just more curated games, whether it's a private private game in a casino, a stream game, or even a home game, a lot of the big fish and action players are just being sucked up out of the ecosystem from the public low stakes games. So it is just much more rare to run into a big action player who's going to be there 3, 4, 5 days a week at low stakes. On the other hand, even though there's less big whales, trying players can be exploited too. It just takes a little bit more nuance than when we are dealing with fish. So how do we exploit trying players? Well, we've gone over a few of the examples already, so let's summarize here. Pre-flop, we should be 3-betting them very aggressively because they under 4-bet. On the flop, as a pre-flop raiser, we should just be c-betting our entire range versus them. They play poorly against this. They just check raise way too little. They just fast play their strong hands way too much. And on the flop, as a pre-flop caller, we talked about this before, we should just be check raising them extremely aggressively if they are splitting their sizes with their good hands and their bad hands. So all the small sizes, if they're splitting their sizes, we should just be check raising super aggro. Or if they're just using one size, we should float a lot of our range if they're just kind of c-betting their entire range, and then they're kind of face up on turn, so if they check back the turn, we just overbet bluff the river, or if we have showdown value, we just bluff catch on the river. On the turn as a pre-flop raiser, we just double barrel all of our non-showdown value because they get there too wide, and on the turn as a pre-flop caller, we just massively overfold because they under double barrel. Finally, on the river as the pre-flop raiser, we are just going to triple barrel all of our non-showdown value because players overfold now on rivers. They're capable of folding top pair, and because in general the player pool is so fearful, they check raise almost all of their good hands on the flop or on the turn. Now there are some exceptions, but most of the time we can get players to the river with kind of a wide, weak, capped range. So bluffing on rivers with all of our hands that don't have showdown value becomes very profitable. Finally, as the pre-flop caller, we should be massively overfolding on rivers because players are just massively under triple barrel bluffing. The pool in general, the frequency for which they should be triple barrel bluffing, they are underdoing it by like a magnitude of 3, 4, 5, maybe 10x for a lot of players. So if we get to a spot where they are under bluffing and we have a bluff catcher, every bluff catcher is more profitable as a fold than as a call. And just to give you guys a little bit more confidence on this, why we should just be massively overfolding against the pool is because how often do you see a player in your game run a bluff, someone folds, and then the player who bluffed windmills the cards? They proudly show their bluff. They show the table they're bluffing. Why do you think they show the table they're bluffing? Well, they want the table to think they're capable of bluffing next time. Why? Because the next time and the 12 times after that, they are going to have it. Players who are bluffing at an appropriate frequency or players who are over bluffing, they don't show the bluffs. Before I did this vlog, before I was making content, I just did not show the bluffs ever. I've been playing a similar style for 8 years now, and my reputation in LA in these games has always been kind of a tight ABC grinder knit. Now, I've been over bluffing the entire time, but when I get called generally, I tend to have it, and when I get the bluffs through, I never ever show. So if players in your games are showing the bluff, don't be fearful that they're going to windmill a bluff in your face. The reason why they're showing the bluff is because that's the 1 out of 12 times that they're bluffing, and they want action the next 11 times when they have it. If they're showing the bluff to you, that means they are under bluffing. Finally, the last reason why games are tougher is the pool is better than ever before. Every year players get better, and it's kind of like we're on a treadmill here, and if we're just slightly getting better every year, we're just kind of keeping up with the player pool. If you're not studying, if you're not constantly working on the game, your win rate is going to go down. The player pool is much stronger now than they were 8 years ago at low stakes when I was playing low stakes in my first year playing full time. But on the other hand, it's never been easier to get good at poker. The preponderance, that's a good word, preponderance of tools out there, all of the free content on YouTube, including Hungry Horse Poker. This stuff just wasn't widely available 8 or 9 years ago when I was playing these games. Everything was behind a paywall, and even the information behind a paywall was sometimes bad, sometimes okay, sometimes horrible. You had to sift through a lot of BS to get to the good stuff, and today there's just so much good poker strategy advice out there with the proliferation of solvers, with AI, with all of the training content. It is so much easier to get better at poker today. So even though the pool gets better every year, if you're willing to put in a little work, you can outpace them by such a big amount, just because it requires way less work today to get better than it did 8 years ago. So even though the player pool is better, people still don't want to work. People still don't want to study, even pros, even players who are playing full time. So if you're willing to put in a little bit of work, you can advance leaps and bounds beyond the player pool that you are playing with. All right, finally, what you've all been waiting for, let's dig into the results. And first, I want to show you guys my results from 2017. And these are only my results playing 5-5, my first year playing poker in 2017. So I took out when I started moving up to 5-10 and 10-20. This is only 5-5. And as you can see, I was making about $65 or 15 big blinds an hour in 2017. And this is over about 1,000-hour sample. And I just want to preface this with, yes, the games were better. Yes, the games were a bit softer, but I was horrible. I was nowhere near the player I am today, and I still make a ton of mistakes now, but the mistakes I was making then were just absolutely atrocious on every street. If I went back and looked at my play then, I would probably be pretty disgusted. But the overall point is, over a pretty big sample, 1,000 hours, I was making over 15 big blinds per hour as not a particularly strong player. And we see here my results from the challenge. I did just about 300 hours. It was really tough for me to get in volume by the end. I am a new first-time dad, and the baby came a few weeks early, so I was planning to finish the challenge, so I kind of had to squeeze in those last couple sessions where I had a couple hours here and there. So we see I did not make $100 an hour, but we see here 18 big blinds per hour, pretty respectable win rate. And if we throw the jackpot in there, which I'm not, but I'm just showing you guys, if we throw the jackpot in there, which just is essentially rakeback, we were at about $109 an hour. So the question that I set out to answer, is $100 an hour possible at low stakes? And my truthful, honest answer is, I don't know. And on top of that, I'm not really sure it matters. What I set out to do was answer this question, and even though I still don't know the answer to this question, I think hopefully what I showed is the poker dream is still alive, even at low stakes. Making 6 figures a year playing live poker is very, very achievable playing low stakes. And if you do have access to bigger games, whether it's a 5-10 game or a 10-20 game or a match the stack game or whatever, I think making $200,000 or $250,000 a year is still very, very, very achievable for a live pro working 40 hours a week. You don't have to be Linus Love or a top player to do this. So overall, no, I'm not sure if a triple-digit hourly at a $5 blind game is feasible long term. And 300 hours is not a big enough sample to definitively conclude one way or the other. Even if I played 1,000 hours or 2,000 hours, I'm not sure it would prove anything, right? Maybe it would prove that in the hustler game, in the hours I played with the bomb pots on against the players I played at the times I played sessions, well, maybe it would prove that that win rate was possible. But does that translate to a game in Oklahoma City or Boise, Idaho, or Dallas, Texas? Probably not. So my big takeaway is, going forward in 2025, the live poker dream is still alive and well. And to me, that is great news. And even if I didn't achieve $100 an hour, I had a blast doing this challenge. I hope you guys enjoyed it and maybe learned something along the way. Thank you guys for following along. I'll see you guys soon. Have a gentle day.